Welcome back, everyone. Ready to dive in. Today we're tackling executive orders, and we've got a mountain of sources to dig through. Congressional hearings, legal analyses, historical accounts. We even found some interesting stuff on YouTube.
It's fascinating stuff, really. When you look at executive orders, you see this constant push and pull between the president and Congress.
Right. It's this power play that can really reshape the political landscape.
Yeah, and sometimes it happens even faster than Congress can pass laws.
Exactly. So the big question we're wrestling with today is, are these executive orders a vital tool for presidents in a world that's changing so rapidly?
Or,
Or do they give the president too much power? Are we tipping the scales too far toward the Oval Office?
that's a great question. And to unpack it, I think we need to start with the basics. What exactly is an executive order?
All right, Executive Orders 101. Let's get back to basics.
Okay, so an executive order is a legally binding directive from the president to federal agencies. What at ISNT is legislation passed by Congress.
So it's not about creating brand new laws, right? It's more about how the president wants existing laws put into action.
Exactly. It's about setting priorities for how the government operates. Of course, there are rules. Executive orders have to be published in the Federal Register.
Makes sense. Keeps things transparent and out in the open.
Exactly. Transparency and accountability.
But okay, what's stopping a president from just issuing any order they want? Is there anything to hold them back?
Well, the Constitution and Congress both have a say. For an executive order to be valid, it has to be rooted in either the Constitution itself
Okay,
or in a law that Congress has already passed.
so no going rogue, huh? It has to connect back to some existing legal ground.
Exactly.
But even with those limits, history's full of presidents who have used executive orders to make some pretty big waves.
Oh, absolutely. Some landmark examples come to mind. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation during the Civil War is a prime example. He used an executive order to declare slaves in Confederate states free.
Wow, talk about a bold move. A nation divided, and Lincoln uses this power to challenge the very fabric of society. It's incredible how executive orders can shift the course of history like that.
Yeah, it's pretty powerful stuff. And then you have FDR during the Great Depression. He issued a wave of executive orders to create those New Deal programs.
The New Deal, it wasn't just temporary relief, was it?
No, not at all. The New Deal fundamentally changed the relationship between the government and the economy,
You're right. It was a huge expansion of the government's role.
providing jobs, relief for the unemployed.
Reshaping the financial system, the ripple effects are still felt today.
Absolutely. And then there's Truman desegregating the armed forces in 1948, another powerful example of an executive order pushing social progress forward, especially when Congress was slow to act.
It really highlights how executive orders can sometimes be a catalyst for change, especially when facing resistance. But we can't just focus on the positive examples, can we?
You're right.
There have been times when executive orders have been used in ways that are, let's say, less than ideal.
Definitely.
The internment of Japanese Americans during World War II comes to mind. It's a stark reminder that even with good intentions, executive power can have deeply troubling consequences.
A very dark chapter in American history. It's a stark reminder that power can be used for good or for ill. That's why we have those checks and balances in place, right? So how does that work with executive orders? Can Congress or the courts push back against them?
Right, because it's not like the president gets the final word. There's got to be some back and forth.
There is, for sure, and it often leads to quite a tug of war. Congress has a few tools at its disposal. They can pass laws to overturn specific orders, control funding to limit implementation, or hold oversight hearings to keep agencies in check.
So it's this constant back and forth.
Exactly. It's not a one-way street.
And the courts can step in too, right?
They can, absolutely. If a court decides an executive order is unconstitutional, they can strike it down.
That reminds me of Truman's attempt to seize steel mills during the Korean War. The Supreme Court put a stop to that, didn't they?
They did.
And more recently, we saw Trump's travel ban facing all those legal challenges. It seems like every executive order these days ends up in court.
It's become a key battleground in the political arena. And speaking of battles, our sources actually include excerpts from a 1999 congressional hearing where representatives were expressing some serious concerns about presidents potentially overstepping their bounds with executive orders.
Wow, so this debate has been going on for a while.
Yeah, it's not a new concern. Even back then, it was a hot topic.
What were their main worries back then? What were they saying?
Some representatives argued that Congress had essentially handed the president a blank check.
A blank check.
Yeah, they felt like the president had too much leeway to act without proper oversight.
I see.
They were worried about presidents using executive orders to implement policies that Congress had specifically chosen not to act on.
So bypassing the whole legislative process, I can see why you'd be concerned.
Yeah, it raises a lot of questions about the balance of power, and here's the interesting part. Despite all these concerns, Congress hasn't really put hard limits on executive orders.
Really? They haven't?
Nope. Some legal experts in that hearing even said it would be incredibly difficult to do so without creating even bigger constitutional issues.
So it's this tricky balancing act. Congress wants to keep the president in check, but they also don't want to tie their hands completely, especially in times of crisis.
Right, it's a delicate balance.
This whole thing just highlights how complex the relationship is between Congress and the executive branch.
And that relationship has only become more complicated in today's political landscape, especially with the rise of social media.
Oh, absolutely. Think about it. Presidents can now communicate directly with the public.
Yeah. No need to go through traditional media anymore.
Right. They can bypass those filters and shape public opinion in a whole new way.
It's like they have this megaphone that amplifies their message.
And that can put immense pressure on Congress, can't it?
It can. They either fall in line or face the wrath of public opinion. It's a whole new layer to this power dynamic.
It's almost like the president can bypass Congress and appeal directly to the people, making these executive orders even more potent.
Exactly. It's a game changer.
Okay, so we've got this fascinating historical backdrop, but where does that leave us today?
That's a great question, and it's one we'll dive into next. Welcome back.
It's amazing how much ground we've covered already.
Right. From the history of executive orders to that constant push and pull between the president and Congress.
Yeah, but I keep coming back to this question. Is this really how our system was designed to work?
It's a question a lot of people are asking these days, especially now. A lot of our sources highlight this ongoing debate about whether executive orders, as they're being used today, are giving the president too much power.
It feels like we keep bumping into this theme throughout history,
We do. It's a recurring theme.
but it does seem even more pronounced now.
You're right. And some argue that Congress has basically abdicated its responsibility, allowing the president to make these sweeping changes without enough checks.
So it's like they've given the president a blank check and just hoped for the best.
Well, it is a bit more complicated than that,
Okay.
but I get the concern. They point to instances where presidents have used these orders to make big policy decisions, even in areas where Congress has actively chosen not to legislate.
That reminds me of the unitary executive theory.
Ah, yes, the unitary executive.
It's this idea that the president has broad inherent powers to manage the executive branch.
And that Congress can't really interfere.
Right, so even if it clashes with what Congress intended, the president gets to call the shots when it comes to implementing laws. Doesn't that create some serious potential for conflict?
Well, it definitely can. Proponents of this theory often point to the vesting clause in Article 2 of the Constitution, the one that says the executive power shall be vested in a president. They interpret that clause pretty broadly, suggesting the president has a wide range of authority over the entire executive branch.
But wouldn't that lead to an imbalance of power? What about checks and balances?
That's exactly the argument you hear from those who oppose this expansive view of executive power.
Makes sense.
They argue that the Founding Fathers never intended for the president to have this kind of unchecked authority.
Right, it was all about dividing power.
Exactly. They emphasize Congress's role in lawmaking and holding the president accountable.
But if that's the case, why hasn't Congress taken more concrete steps to limit the president's ability to issue these orders? It seems like there have been plenty of opportunities.
It's tricky. It's a complex issue. Some experts suggest that Congress needs to be more assertive in using its existing powers.
Okay, so what would that look like?
Well, they could pass laws that specifically restrict the president's authority in certain areas, for example.
I see.
Others have even proposed reforms like requiring congressional approval for major executive orders.
Oh, interesting. So they'd have to get the green light from Congress first.
Exactly, or at least making it easier for Congress to overturn them.
It sounds like they're trying to walk a tightrope.
They are. It's all about finding that balance between giving the president enough flexibility to act decisively when needed, but also preventing an overreach of power.
Yeah, that makes sense. And this whole balancing act is made even harder in today's world.
Oh, tell me about it. Things are moving so fast.
Right. And the rise of social media has completely changed the game.
Completely. The fact that the president can directly reach millions of people with a single tweet.
Or a post.
Yeah, it has huge implications for how these executive orders are perceived and debated.
It's true. It allows the president to bypass those traditional media filters
Exactly.
and connect directly with them.
Direct line to the people,
Right. They can frame issues, rally support for their actions.
even if those actions are controversial.
Exactly. It's like they can use public opinion as leverage to push their agenda.
They can, and if the public is on the president's side, it puts immense pressure on Congress.
To either fall in line
Yeah,
or face the wrath of public opinion.
it creates a whole new dynamic.
It's important how technology has changed how we talk about politics and even the power dynamics in Washington.
It's a whole new world.
But let's bring this back to the listener for a moment.
Okay.
Why should they care about all of this? How do these executive orders actually affect their everyday lives?
Well, the truth is, executive orders touch our lives in countless ways.
Really?
Oh, yeah, they affect everything, from the cost of groceries to access to health care to how we protect the environment.
Wow, I never thought about it like that.
It's like this invisible hand shaping the world around us.
And we don't even realize it.
A lot of times, no. Remember President Obama's executive order on immigration back in 2014?
The one that created DACA?
That's the one. It shielded young, undocumented immigrants brought to the U.S. as children from deportation. That order impacted the lives of hundreds of thousands of people and ignited this nationwide debate about immigration policy.
And we saw President Biden reverse a lot of President Trump's policies through executive orders.
He did, a lot of them.
Like that travel ban targeting several Muslim-majority countries.
Right.
Those actions have had huge implications for immigration, foreign policy.
National security?
It's all connected.
It is. And the point is, when you hear about these orders in the news, don't just tune it out.
Right.
These aren't just political maneuvers.
They have real consequences.
They do. They're decisions that have real-world consequences for all of us.
It's a call to action for listeners, isn't it?
It is. Stay informed, do your research, and get involved.
We need to be part of the conversation.
Absolutely. We need to have thoughtful discussions about the role of executive power in our democracy.
Right. It's not about taking sides.
No.
It's about finding that balance between the need for decisive action and protecting those core democratic principles.
Well said.
So we've explored the arguments for and against the expanding use of executive orders. We've looked at the history, the impact of technology. But the question remains, where do we go from here? How do we ensure this power is used responsibly in a world that's constantly changing?
And that's the question we'll tackle in our final segment. We've laid the groundwork. Now let's look for some solutions and look toward the future.
Wow, we've really unpacked a lot about executive orders.
We have.
Their history, how they work with Congress, even how social media's changed the whole power dynamic. It's fascinating. But now I'm wondering, where do we go from here?
Right. Where do we go?
Is there a way to make sure this presidential power, this tool, is used responsibly? Especially in a world that just seems to be changing faster and faster.
That's the million-dollar question, and there are no easy answers. But one thing that keeps coming up in all this research is that we as citizens, we need to be more aware of what's happening.
Right.
And be willing to engage in these conversations.
So it's not enough to just passively follow the news. We need to actively be involved in how this power is used.
Exactly. I mean, the more we understand about executive orders, the better equipped we'll be to actually hold our leaders accountable, right?
Right.
We need to ask the tough questions.
Like what?
Like, what's the context for this action? Is it truly justified? What are the potential long-term consequences? We need to think ahead.
It's like we need to develop this healthy skepticism, right?
Yes. Informed skepticism.
No matter who's in office, we should be carefully considering the implications of their actions.
Especially when it comes to executive orders.
Yeah, because they have such a broad impact,
Absolutely. And we have to be mindful of the potential for executive overreach, even when it's done with good intentions,
It's that whole, the road to hell is paved with good intentions kind of thing.
Exactly. Power can be a very slippery slope.
It's true. We need to be careful, vigilant about making sure it's not abused.
Absolutely. And another thing is encouraging Congress to play a more active role.
Oh, yeah. Congress.
They have the power to push back against these orders,
Right.
But they need to actually use it.
You're talking about those checks and balances again?
I am, and it seems like they've become a bit rusty.
A little bit.
Congress needs to be more assertive in using its powers to hold the president accountable.
Right. So what can they do?
Well, like you talked about earlier, they can pass laws to overturn certain orders. They can control funding to limit their implementation. They can hold those oversight hearings to really scrutinize how agencies are carrying out those orders.
So it's a shared responsibility.
It is.
We as citizens need to stay informed and engaged.
Yes.
And our elected officials in Congress, they need to step up and make sure their voices are heard.
Exactly. It's not just about reacting to executive orders after they've been issued.
Right.
It's about this broader conversation
Okay.
about the role of presidential power in our democracy. We need to be asking ourselves some tough questions. What are the appropriate limits? How do we balance the need for decisive action with, the importance of democratic principles?
These are big questions.
They are.
But important ones.
Really important. We need to be grappling with these as a society.
Absolutely. It's about shaping the future,
Well said. The health of our democracy depends on us.
On all of us.
Being informed and engaged and having a Congress that's willing to stand up for its role, for its constitutional role, as a check on executive power.
I think we've given our listeners a lot to think about today.
I hope so.
Executive orders, they're powerful, but they need to be used carefully and thoughtfully.
I agree.
And it's up to all of us to make sure that this power is used responsibly and for the benefit of all of us.
Not just for the select few.
Exactly. So what examples have you seen in the news lately? What are your thoughts on this balance of power? Keep the conversation going, and until next time, happy deep diving.